The topic for this video is Module 7, Industry Controls, Chapter 20, Investment Industry Documentation for the CFA Institute Investment Foundations Program. So as you can see, here we are in Module 7, Industry Controls, and the topic for this video is Chapter 20, Investment Industry Documentation. And as you can see, there's 50 questions in the online learning ecosystem. There are 6 learning outcomes for this chapter, and after completing this chapter, you should be able to do the following. Learning outcome statement A, define a document. B, describe objectives of documentation. C, describe document classification systems. D, describe types of internal documentation. E, describe types of external documentation. And finally, learning outcome statement F, describe document management. Learning outcome statement A is define a document. Objectives and classification of documentation. Every time an investment manager places an order and purchases security, for instance, a large number of documents are developed to record the trade. A document is a piece of written, printed, or electronic matter that provides information or evidence, or that serves as an official record, for instance, of the purchase or sale of a security. Some documents are for internal use only. They are generally administrative and reflect a company's philosophy, approach, and activities. Other documents are for external use. These documents convey information to and from the public domain and often help limit the risks that interaction with the public creates. Learning outcome statement B is describe objectives of documentation. When policies and procedures are undocumented, there is room for doubt, and poor quality documentation may be subject to interpretation or undue influence. Proper documentation removes ambiguity and is thus critical. In the context of the investment industry, documentation does the following. Number 1, it educates. It informs or provides instruction. Number 2, it communicates, conveys ideas, concepts, or information. Number 3, it authorizes, provides the basis and often the authority for action. Number 4, it formalizes, establishes roles, deliverables, and obligations. Number 5, it organizes, ensures thoroughness and consistency of action, allowing the company to function more efficiently and effectively. Number 6, the objective of documentation is that it measures. It provides a benchmark for measurement and audit. Number 7, it records, preserves corporate learning, institutional memory. And finally, number 8, it protects. It provides assurance of a system to safeguard interests and manage risks. From a legal perspective, documents establish proof of existence, authority, activity, and obligations. So you can see here, here's a list. You want to put together some type of memorizing flashcard. 1 to 8, educates, communicates, authorizes, formalizes, organizes, measures, records, and protects. And so, for example, and a couple of words to help you remember what the key points is. So in terms of records, it preserves corporate learning, institutional memory. So you need to match up a couple of key words, okay? So a quick question from the learning ecosystem at the expert level. And the question is, in the context of the investment industry, records help A, establish roles, deliverables, and obligations, B, provide benchmarks for measurements and audits, or C, preserve corporate learning, institutional memory. Okay, you can see the correct answer is C, records help preserve corporate learning, and this is just coming from the 8 objectives of documentation. As you can see, you pretty much have to memorize the list of 8 and some of the key words. So educates, informs or provides information, communicates, conveys ideas, authorizes, basis for authority. Just have to pick up a couple of the key words. Formalizes, roles, deliverables, obligations, 3 words. Organizes, thoroughness, consistency of action, measures, benchmark for measurement, records, preserves corporate learning, and protects, assurance of a system. So you can see A, establish roles and deliverables and obligations. No, that's formalizes, okay? And you can see B, provide benchmarks for measurement and audits. No, that's measures. So you can see very clearly there could easily be a type of question on the exam regarding this learning outcome statement with the objectives of documentation. There's 8 objectives, and there's a couple of words. Pretty much need to create a flashcard to memorize that. Moving on now to Learning Outcome Statement C. Learning Outcome Statement C is describe document classification systems. And when using or reviewing a document, there are 3 factors to consider: origin, direction, and level of standardization. Origin relates to the source of the document and may be classified by their sources as original documents, derived documents, or associated documents. For example, assume an employee travels for work and incurs expenses while doing so. The receipt of a taxi for a taxi or train ticket, that's an original document. The expense claim form the employee has to fill out upon her return is a derived document. The document that comes into existence because of other documents, in this case, the taxi receipt or the train ticket. So a derived document comes into existence because of other documents. And finally, the company's travel policy document is an associated document. When filling out the expense claim form, the employee may have to refer to the travel policy document, which to determine which expenses will be reimbursed. So that's very important to understand the difference between original document, derived documents, and associated documents. On this slide, we're going to review the direction of documents and level of standardization. So documents flow in different directions. Typically, documents associated with policies and procedures flow down through a company. The travel policy document may flow down from the Human Resources Department to all employees via an employee handbook. In contrast, documents associated with reporting flow up. For example, the monthly reports produced by the sales team flow up from each team to management. A distinction can be made between standardized and ad hoc documents. Standardized documents have the benefit of foresight. That's a very important sentence. There's questions based on that. Standardizations have the benefit of foresight. They are crafted for a specific purpose and consider various alternative uses. Some standard contracts are tailored by negotiation, but their form, content, and purpose have been pre-established. Now, ad hoc documents, such as letters, memos, and emails, are typically informal. The free-form nature of these ad hoc documents mean they carry additional risk for the company, particularly when the records are subpoenaed in a legal dispute. Consequently, companies may implement policies and procedures to impose a process of peer review for such ad hoc communication. Peer review should be documented and auditable. So in the text, example number 2 illustrates the objective, origin, direction, and level of standardization of documentation for a policy relating to risk management, a topic covered in the previous chapter in this module, risk management. So the objective of a risk management policy is to authorize, formalize, and communicate in order to explain the company's risk tolerance and risk appetite. The origin of the risk management policy, the document, is derived from regulation, but specific to the company, associated with the company's mission and strategy, and a variety of related internal documents. The direction, this is an internal document that flows from the top down. And finally, with regards to level of standardization, a document regarding risk management policy will have standardized policy template formally drafted, approved by the company's board of directors or similar governance body, and is adopted by management, implemented by the risk management and compliance groups. So a quick practice question to check our understanding from the learning ecosystem expert level. The question is, when a firm generates a document responding to a request for its compliance procedures regarding soft dollars, from the firm's perspective, the derived document is A, the document responding to the request, B, the document in which the request is made, or C, a procedural document referenced in the responding document. So you can see this is very much a English language test subject documentation. And A is correct. The derived document is the document responding to the request. The document responding to the request is the derived document based on the associated document that explains the compliance procedures regarding soft dollars. The document is which the request is made is not derived. It's not a derived document for the firm. And the procedural document referenced in the responding document is an associated document. So we need to get some language clear with regards to a derived document and an associated document. Learning outcome statement D is describe types of internal documentation. So internal documents are generally administrative and formalize policies, procedures, and processes. So remember that policies come before procedures, come before processes, okay? Policies broadly set the rules, procedures help apply policies, and processes divide procedures into manageable actions, okay? So policies, procedures, and processes. Memorize them in that order. Internal documents are fundamental to conveying a company's philosophy, approach, and activities. Companies in the investment industry, similar to all companies, are expected to have policies and procedures in place to ensure compliance by employees with applicable laws and regulations. It is important to document these policies and procedures so that the company can prove it is in compliance if it is inspected by regulators. It is also important to document that the company follows and enforces its policies and procedures. Now we're moving on to section 3.1, which is document creation. Policies, procedures, and processes are living documents and should be subject to a regular review and confirmation process as a function of good governance. This review and confirmation process should not be merely event-driven. Even without a notable event, attitudes and practices change over time. If policies and procedures are not regularly reviewed, they can become outdated and even obsolete. A regular review process is often managed with the use of registers, which are documents containing obligations, past actions, and future or outstanding requirements. Registers of the previous and next review dates should be maintained by a control function, generally compliance or an internal audit function, and scheduled for discussion. A sign-off process is generally also incorporated into the document template. Now we're moving on to policy documentation. Laws and regulations require that companies in the investment industry maintain certain policy documents. Policy documents often describe the company's mission, vision, values, and objectives. These documents should be consistent with the company's documents and bylaws, which summarize the legal identity, purpose, and activities of the company. One role of the board of directors is to ensure that the company works within the law and in doing so protects and represents the interests of all stakeholders. The keys to good policy documentation are simplicity and transparency. Policy statements do not need to be overly detailed, but they should include a statement of intent that explains the purpose and goals of the policy. The statement of intent should cover the circumstances under which the policy is invoked and establish any parameters for its use. The policy document should also clearly designate who needs to comply with the policy and who is responsible for controlling and monitoring activities. So we're looking at example 5 from the text where there's a policy statement, and we look at 4 procedures, and then finally the processes. So again, policies broadly set the rules, procedures help apply policies, and processes divide procedures into manageable actions, okay? So the policy statement is to ensure stakeholder confidence and hence support, the firm must demonstrate the application of the highest standards present in the jurisdiction in which it operates. So you can see that broadly is setting the rules. Then it's moving down to 4 procedures. The 4 procedures are identify the highest standards, number 1. Number 2, monitor compliance. 3, identify breaches and implement remedial action. And 4, train employees to mitigate breaches. So those are procedures that help apply the policies. And finally, when we move down to the processes, you can see for each procedure there's a couple of processes. So for Procedure number 1, identify the highest standards. 2 processes. 1, create a register of all the legal and regulatory obligations across all jurisdictions. And again, that register needs to be reviewed and updated, internal audit or compliance department, okay? Number 2 is to monitor changes in the legal and regulatory obligations and update the register. In terms of monitoring compliance, procedure number 2, the 2 processes. Number 1, check that all employees comply with firm policies. Number 2, check that licensed representatives comply with all rules, laws, and regulations. Moving on to procedure number 3, identify breaches and implement remedial action. There are 2 processes. 1, review procedure 2 to identify breaches, and 2, to remedy each breach. And finally, with regards to procedure number 4, train employees to mitigate breaches. There's 2 processes there. Conduct compliance training for each new employee upon hiring. And number 2, conduct annual compliance training for all employees. So you can see policies broadly set the rules, procedures help apply policies, and finally, processes divide procedures into manageable actions. We say if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So it's down at the processes. You can measure the amount of trainings that you did. You can measure the trainings that each employee did. You can measure the times that the register was updated, etc. So processes are very much measurable, and policies are much more broadly set rules. Now we're looking at section 3.3, procedure and process documentation. Making changes is never easy, so it is advisable to make processes modular. That is, they should be made up of separate elements that can be reviewed and replaced independently of each other. Modular processes allow companies to avoid replacing everything when a single element changes. In addition, some processes may be repetitive, so a particular process can be documented just once and then referenced a number of times when drafting procedures. An important consideration when creating or reviewing procedures is risk management. Without a strong control environment, processes are at risk of error. Failure to follow processes can lead to damage to the company's reputation and the loss of existing and potential business opportunities. As with policies, context is critical in the creation of procedures and processes. Understanding where inputs come from, where outputs go, and what they will be used for provides that context. All procedure documents follow a similar pattern. An input initiates an activity that results in an output. Process flow diagrams, such as the one provided in the next slide, are a good visual aid to provide context because they show the sources of inputs and the uses of outputs in processes. In particular, they help visualize a chain of linked activities and thus represent a simple and efficient tool when a number of contingent activities take place. So now we're going to look at a process flow diagram. And the policy is that gifts worth more than $100 require compliance approval to determine potential conflicts of interest. So the procedure is gift management. Okay, so the policy is regarding gifts worth more than $100. The procedure is gift management. So assume that an asset management firm has a gift policy stipulating that gifts worth more than $100 require compliance approval. The policy is intended to prevent conflicts of interest that might arise if receiving gifts influences employees' behavior. So the asset management firm has established procedures and processes that employees must follow when offered gifts. Suppose an employee receives a case of wine as a gift from a brokerage firm she regularly uses. Before making a decision about accepting or rejecting the gift, the employee should refer to her firm's gift policy, which describes the procedures and processes to follow. So, even before receiving the gift, you may want to be familiar with the procedures and policies. Okay, so the first procedure refers to gift management. The first process in that procedure starts when the employee receives the case of wine. That is the input. So the input is when the employee receives the case of wine. But before that, you want to be familiar with the policies and procedures. Okay. Her first activity is to record this gift in the automated system, which triggers a notification to the compliance system. That is the output. So the input receives a gift, activity recorded in the automated system, and the output is compliance is notified to determine the gift eligibility. Okay. If the gift is eligible, the employee receives an automatic notification that she can accept the gift and no further action is required. So the gift is received. If alternatively, the compliance department may need to determine whether there is a potential conflict of interest, which would trigger a second process. So this is considered to be a second process. See, for each process, you've got an activity and an output. So now there's so the gift, compliance notified. Is it eligible? No, but want to determine more information. So compliance determines potential conflicts of interest, and the output here is the employee is notified about the gift eligibility. And so you can see the employee, yes, it's approved, the employee can keep the gift, or no, the employee returns the gift and becomes, or the gift becomes property of the company, okay? A quick practice question to check our understanding from the learning ecosystem at the expert level. Which type of internal document is most likely to provide general guidance and be broadly worded? A, policy, B, process, or C, procedure? Actually, I don't think that's so difficult. A is correct. A policy document typically is broadly worded and provides general guidance for the implementation of procedures to generate processes to meet policy objectives. Okay, so we saw the flow before. Policy objectives followed, they're broadly set. Procedures help apply the policies, and processes divide procedures into manageable actions. And again, a process document tends to be very specific about the roles and activities, and often very measurable. And the procedure document tends to have also very specific guidance and is not broadly worded. Another quick practice question, and maybe this one's a little bit tougher. Anyhow, the question is, an employee handbook that outlines travel reimbursement guidelines is best classified as an A, ad hoc document, B, derived document, or C, associated document. So the correct answer is C. This is where we're going again through the differences between an ad hoc document, a derived document, and an associated document. So this question was about an associated document. You could anticipate on the exam, you'd see something very similar. You have to know the definitions and differences between ad hoc, derived, and associated. Anyhow, C is correct. An employee handbook that outlines travel reimbursement guidelines is an associated document that employees would refer to in order to determine which travel expenses may or may not be reimbursed. Remember, an ad hoc document is typically informal. Because an employee handbook usually describes policies and procedures, it is more likely to be a standardized document rather than an ad hoc document. And also B is incorrect. Remember, a derived document comes into an existence because of other documents. In this context, an expense claim form would be a better example of the derived document. Remember the taxi receipt or airline receipt? That was the original document, and the expense claim is the derived document. Ad hoc documents, emails, things like that, not formal, and an associated document, that's like a handbook that outlines guidelines. So learning outcome statement E is describe types of external documentation. So now we're moving into documents that are external to the company. Remember the internal documents, policies, procedures, and processes. Now we're moving to external documents. These are interactions with clients, service providers, market participants, entities that are external to the company. Okay, so external documents are often legally binding and aim to articulate business relationships and obligations undertaken by the parties invoked and are often legally binding. So examples of external documents in the investment industry are a contract between a buyer and a seller of an asset, an investment management agreement between a firm and a client, and a know your client, some people call it KYC document, for a new client. So those are examples of external documents. Okay, KYC is an external document. Because contracts and other legally binding documents are governed by law and are enforceable, involved parties are usually motivated to comply with them. If any of the parties fail to fulfill their obligations, the law offers the other party or parties varying levels of protection or help. External documents may also be used to inform the public or other external parties about a company's activities or changes in its business, for example. A press release announcing the appointment of a new CEO. So that's an external document. It's informing the public about a company's activity. A press announcement announcing the appointment of a new CEO. A marketing presentation for a statement about the launch of a new investment product. And also another example would be a new website containing company information. Okay? So this next slide is going through an example of some different stages of the typical client interaction and then focusing on some of the external documentation. So in the 3 slides after this, we're going to be looking at marketing, then client onboarding, and funding in more detail and some of the documents at those stages of the typical client interaction. Now remember, the client onboarding, we looked at that in the chapter on investor needs and the chapter on investment management, okay? We talked about client onboarding. The documentation is the KYC, know your customer or know your client. Other examples of documentation at that stage are the investor policy statement, and also it might be a risk questionnaire to judge the willingness of the client to take on risk. So we should be familiar with the client onboarding and also the funding, putting money into the investment account and then going through that investment management process and reporting back to you. We should be familiar with that from the chapters on investors and their needs and the investment management. Okay, so an important thing to note, though, that some of the external documentation at different stages is the marketing. The marketing, the interaction between the customer and the firm can happen well before there's any onboarding. Okay, so some of the other stages that require documentation reporting. Remember the Bernie Madoff scandal, and this is one of the things that I mentioned was with regards to the reporting. The reporting was coming on Bernie Madoff letterhead, and no one was asking, well, who's the custodian of my assets? Where are those assets held? Could you show some evidence of that? Or so that was an issue of the reporting. It's made up reporting. It was fraudulent reporting. Another stage in of typical client interaction where there's investment events, a rights offering. We've seen that before. There's a communication to the shareholder on record, redemptions of funds, some types of communication. Anyhow, at different stages of the client interaction, there's going to be different types of external documentation. In this slide, we're going to look in more detail at the marketing documentation for a company in the investment industry. Okay, so most companies in the investment industry share the same basic objective of winning clients. So most companies' documentation at the marketing stage of the cycle shares the same purpose: to promote and position the company's products and services to persuade the clients to invest. Marketing documentation for a company in the investment industry typically includes the following: presentation materials that provide background on the company, its products, and/or its services. Number 2, offering documentation such as a prospectus or term sheet, which are legal documents that contain detailed information about the terms and conditions of the investment opportunity, highlight various risks, and make other required disclosures. Fact sheets about the company's products that provide short summaries of the investments and typically detail historical performance. For asset management firms, the marketing documentation also contains information about the managers, including their investment strategy and competitive advantages. Marketing materials are typically regulated to ensure that companies in the investment industry provide fair representations of their products and services. Now we're looking at, in more detail, at client onboarding and the documentation, the types of external documentation. So client onboarding is the process by which a company accepts a new client and inputs the client's details into its records to enable the company to conduct transactions with and on behalf of the client. The typical Know Your Client KYC process requires the client to complete a questionnaire and provide personal background information, including documentary proof of identity, for instance, a passport, addresses, and other personal details. The typical KYC process also requires the client to be screened against various global databases to ascertain whether he or she is known or wanted by local or international law enforcement agencies. The client also has to submit to anti-money laundering checks at onboarding and thereafter to identify any potential suspicious transactions that the company would be obligated to report to a regulator. And finally, the typical KYC process requires the client to provide proof of the source of funds to verify that the money does not originate from an illegal or criminal source. Moreover, the KYC process is important in setting the basis for the relationship, in particular to differentiate between discretionary and non-discretionary relationships. So this is very important to understand the difference between discretionary and non-discretionary. Discretionary relationships permit the service provider to act on behalf of the client, for example, as an investment manager with a specific mandate or as a trustee of a trust. In such cases, the service provider must act in the best interests of its client. In contrast, a non-discretionary relationship permits the service provider to undertake only specific tasks that are authorized by the client on a per-task basis. So non-discretionary relationship, every task has to be authorized by the client each time. In a non-discretionary relationship, a non-discretionary portfolio manager can just buy and sell and trade without authorization on individual trades because they're operating within a specific mandate. They've got this discretionary authority to make those decisions, but in a non-discretionary relationship, each and every transaction, each and every task must be, that's investment related, must be signed off by the investor. So shares cannot be bought and sold without the client agreeing, yes, I agree and accept, that's good advice, I will buy that stock. Now we're looking at the documentation regarding funding. Once the client onboarding process is complete and the relationship has been initiated and approved by the compliance department, the next stage is the cash transfer and the investment of the money. After receiving the money, the company initiates the investment transaction and sends a formal confirmation to the client. Each step in the funding process relies on external documentation to formalize, legalize, and protect the rights and obligations of each of the parties involved. Service providers may provide transaction, safekeeping, or administrative services to the client or the company, and external documentation would also be used to record activities related to these activities. Now we're going to look in more detail at trading documentation. Documentation is important in trading to provide a record of which assets were ordered and traded in what quantity and at what price. This diagram shows a simplified version of the trading process as presented in the Functioning of Financial Markets chapter. It illustrates some of the documents over here that would be required or may be produced during a trade. Depending on the asset, where it is traded, and between which counterparties, the documentation required can vary widely. When an order is placed, a document is sent to the chosen trading venue specifying what security to trade, whether to buy or sell, and how much should be bought or sold. Once the order has been received, a number of documents record the progress of the trade until execution. These include a submitted for dealing note, a confirmation of dealing, and a contract note once the trade is complete. Once the trade has been settled, the settlement agent reports the trade to the issuing company's transfer agents. Remember, the transfer agent is where the shareholder's name is recorded so that if there's dividends or proxy voting, it's the shareholder of record that is kept at the transfer agent. Okay. Anyhow, so you can see order placed. There's order documents. Is it a market order? Yes, then it's going to be executed immediately at the best price. And if it's not, if it's a limit order, then again we went through that process. Is it then eventually executed? Yes, the order is settled. If it is not executed, will it remain open? Good till canceled, maximum 30 days, etc. If it doesn't get executed, then the order is going to close. So again, we've looked at something similar to this back in another chapter, but now we're just looking at some of the trading documentation. So in terms of trading floor execution instructions, and then over here, submitted for dealing note, confirmation note, contract note. That's progress of the trade until execution. And then here, finally, the order settled. There's a notification to the issuer's transfer agent. Okay, we're working our way through external documentation, working through a client investment cycle, looked at some of the marketing documents before a client is onboarded, KYC documents, etc., investment policy statement, documents regarding funding, documents regarding, and now we're looking at documents regarding reporting, and then you can see we're going to finish off with documents regarding investment events and redemption, okay? But anyhow, getting on to reporting. After funding, regular communication will occur between the company and its client. Evaluation, if a market price is available, or an appraisal, that is, an estimation if no market price is available, of each asset held is sent to the client on a regular basis. Reporting documentation usually takes the form of a statement, often provided by a third-party custodian or an administrator. We've talked about that enough. Along with valuation and performance statements, clients may receive a range of other documents such as investment reports, annual financial statements, and risk management reports. So again, this reporting is very important. It mentions that it often comes from the third-party custodian or administrator. If it's not from a third-party custodian, you want to know who is that custodian, where are the assets. Moving on now to investment events. Over the life of the investment, numerous events may take place that affect the client or require the client to take action. Some events are expected, such as regular income in the form of interest from a bond investment, dividends from an equity investment, or rental income from a commercial real estate investment. Unexpected events that lead to external documentation include the following: merger and acquisition activity. If a company merges with, spin-offs from, or acquires another company, its business and operations may change, affecting the client's investment. Bankruptcy. If a company files for bankruptcy or undergoes a reorganization, the client may be affected, depending on the nature of the underlying transaction or investment. There will be written communication about the legal process, the rights of the parties involved, and any liquidation. Natural disaster. This type of event may affect a real asset, or even a financial asset. So we're getting down to the last slide for this learning outcome statement. We're looking at redemption. We've looked at all the steps through the client investment cycle: marketing, client onboarding, funding, reporting, investment events. Now we're looking at redemption, and then we're going to do a quick practice question, then move on to the next learning outcome statement. So redemption. At some stage, a client may want to redeem or sell an investment. Depending on the type of investment, a written request may be required. After verifying the authenticity of the client's instructions, the company arranges for the investment to be sold. The timing of redemption depends on the type of investment and its liquidity. When the investment is sold, the company's authorized signatures allow the bank to release the cash proceeds. A final written confirmation statement is then sent to the client. Although redemption is the end of a transaction, it does not necessarily mean the end of the client relationship. The client may want to invest or conduct other transactions with the company in the future. The documentation related to the final transaction will be retained, as discussed in the next section, should there be any future dispute or disagreement between the parties. So a quick practice question from the learning ecosystem, classified as expert. I actually think it's pretty easy. So anyhow, here we go. The question is, the type of documentation that can be received by a client prior to the onboarding process is A, marketing documentation, B, know your client documentation, or C, documentation that determines whether the relationship is discretionary. Okay, the correct answer is A. The type of documentation that can be received by a client prior, that it means before the onboarding process, is marketing documentation. So you can see marketing documentation happens before the client onboarding. Know your client documentation, that's part of the onboarding process. We've mentioned that several times. And also documentation that determines if a relationship is discretionary or non-discretionary is part of the onboarding process. Other documents in the onboarding process, recall the IPS is a big one. So now we're moving on to Learning Outcome Statement F, which is Describe Document Management. And we're looking at Section 5.1 on Information Technology. It should by now be clear that documents serve an important role in establishing the rules by which a product or service is supplied, in formalizing the rights and entitlements of ownership, and recording events that take place after the purchase of an asset. Information technology has greatly enhanced our ability to collect, collate, manage, and distribute documents. It has also greatly advanced the automation of processes, to a large degree eliminating the need for some traditional internal documentation. In the past, rules were physically documented, but today rules-based systems now allow enforcement of processes by building controls into operating systems. Thanks to the advent of straight-through processing, STP, also referred to as straight-through exception processing, or STEP, the need for manual intervention has been removed. It is often possible to capture inputs, including client interactions, from outside the company by directly accessing a company's IT systems. In some instances, the need for physical documentation has completely disappeared. Examples include the use of internet banking and online share trading, which eliminate the need for deposit withdrawal slips and trade order tickets. The use of IT can also reduce risk. For example, the payment of funds from an investment account may be subject to fraud. To limit the risk of fraud, payments typically require a dual sign-off process. If implemented correctly, a dual sign-off process makes collusion between two parties easier to identify. The manual sign-off process involves a physical check and two signatories, which is time-consuming and prone to errors. A fully automated process that relies on dual independent blind input with automated reconciliation and release reduces the risk of errors and the time for review. So now we're looking at Section 5.2, which is access, security, retention, and disposal of documents. So we're looking at managing documents, accessing the documents, security around documents, retention of documents, and disposal of documents. The importance of document management cannot be overemphasized. Access. When we're talking about access, documents that staff need to access should be easily retrievable. Companies usually have a centralized repository that is often electronic, a read-only drive, document database, or document management system capable of storing internal and external documents relevant to the company's business activities. In terms of security, protecting confidential information is important and often a legal or regulatory requirement. So only authorized staff should be able to access restricted documents such as compensation data or confidential client information. In addition, companies must ensure that no outside party can gain access to documents that are for internal use only. Retention. It is important not only for business reasons, but also often for legal or regulatory reasons that all documents are retained until the risk associated with the action described in the document no longer exists. There are generally laws or policies in place to prescribe document retention. Although most documents today are held electronically, there are still requirements to hold physical original documents such as certificates of title, contracts, and trust deeds. In terms of disposal, documents cannot simply be archived and forgotten. Specific destruction or disposal instructions should be applied to all archived information. Companies have a responsibility to discard or destroy documentation after the retention period. Most developed markets have strict legislation around data protection and companies' obligations to permanently delete confidential information, whether stored in electronic or paper format. So a quick practice question to end this video, end this learning outcome statement, end this topic, and end the series, because this is chapter 20. So the last practice question: at the expert level, in the document management process, ease of data retrieval is best accomplished by A, retaining information after its initial use, B, maintaining a centralized repository, or C, using sound practices for safekeeping documentation? Okay, the correct answer is B. In the document management process, ease of data retrieval is best accomplished by maintaining a centralized repository. So remember document management, we looked at access, security, retention, and disposal. With regards to access, documents should be easily retrievable, and for documents to be easily retrievable, it's recommended that a central repository is maintained. Retaining information, that's a good positive thing, but it doesn't necessarily imply that that data will be easily retrieved, okay? Using sound practices for safekeeping documentation, also a very positive thing, but it doesn't necessarily imply ease of data retrieval. So in the document management process, ease of data retrieval best accomplished by maintaining a central repository. Okay, and that's the last slide, last question for this topic. So I recorded these videos in order of the chapters, so this is the last slide for the last chapter. And here's a congratulations note from the CFA Institute. And so this is their slide that I'm communicating to you. And it says, congratulations, you can feel proud that through persistence and hard work, you have now completed a comprehensive education program to provide you with a sound understanding of the investment industry and some of the professional responsibilities within it. You have also acquired a set of ethical and professional standards that should stay with you your entire career. You have, through your learning, acquired a common language with investment industry professionals around the globe. Here are a few ways in which your investment foundation's learning has helped. To start with, a better informed and educated person is more likely to make better and more thoughtful decisions. You should feel more confident in communicating with colleagues and employers because of your enhanced understanding of how the investment industry works and your role in it. You've gained a greater understanding of and appreciation for what various investment roles do, and you have likely enhanced your confidence. And finally, you have raised your credibility for sure once you complete and get that electronic badge and certificate. You are the future of the financial industry. It is imperative that you prioritize ethical behavior in all your dealings with colleagues and clients at all times. The health of the financial system and the wealth of society depend on you and thousands like you. So that is the last slide, and I would just also like to say thank you very much. And that is the conclusion for this video, which was Module 7, Industry Controls, Chapter 20, Investment Industry Documentation for the CFA Institute Investment Foundations Program.
อยากให้เสียงคำเว้าเอาไว้ก่อนอย่าเฝ้าป่าอายเด้อก่อนเด้อคำลาคิดให้ดีก่อนสิเว้าสิพูดจากลับคำสาเด้อน้องลาอายหักคือเก่าสั้นๆที่ความยาวมันบ่ถึงนาทีอาจทำลายหลายล้านนาที สิ่งดีๆที่เฮารวมก่อใจเย็นไว้สาเว้ายังออกมาหูโตบ่นอเรื่องมือนี้อายสิบ่คือต่อแค่อยากขอให้เห็นแก่ฮักเอาเก็บเอาไว้ก่อนคำว่าลาก่อนเสียงไว้สาก่อนคนดีของง่ายตะกี้แต่ก่อนฮักกันสำใดอยากให้ลองตรองดูจะข่าวเก็บเอาไว้ก่อนคำว่าลาก่อนเสียงไว้สาก่อนอย่าด่วนอย่าฟ้าวก็ต้องปากันฮักกันคือเก่าให้เป็นคือเก่าอ้ายขอให้เจ้ากลับคำสาลาคำสั้นๆ